Hello, welcome to George Daily Devotional, episode 43. I left off with one paragraph until reaching chapter 4. So let's just check that one off real quick. Finish up chapter 3 of Interest and the Cause of Interest. George concludes, he just said that interest is just, and then he's going to go on and tell us a little bit more. They who talk about abolishing interest, which I believe is something that the socialists talk about, fall into an error similar to that previously pointed out as giving its plausibility to the doctrine that wages are drawn from capital. So we debunked wages being drawn from capital, and this is an error similar to that. When they thus think of interest, they think only of that which is paid by the user of capital to the owner of capital. But manifestly this is not all interest, but only some interest. Remember, there was some interest is due to the reproductive forces of nature, and then because of the ability that capital grants to exchange, the ability that money provides in the exchange of capital, which is just a function of capital exchange. That means that even capital that doesn't utilize the force of nature must be persuaded to take that form through the incentive of interest, as I understand it. But anyway, manifestly, this is not all interest, but only some interest. Whoever uses capital and obtains the increase it is capable of giving receives interest. If I plant and care for a tree until it comes to maturity, I receive in its fruit interest upon the capital I have thus accumulated. Oh, right. He's just saying, yep. Okay. That is, the labor I have expended. If I raise a cow, the milk which she yields me morning and evening is not merely the reward of the labor then exerted, but interest upon the capital which my labor expended in raising her has accumulated in the cow. And so, if I use my own capital in directly aiding production as by machinery, or in indirectly aiding production in exchange, I receive a special and distinguishable advantage from the reproductive character of capital, which is as real, though perhaps not as clear, as though I had lent my capital to another and he had paid me interest. Interesting. Interesting. Chapter 4 of Spurious Capital and of Profits often mistaken for interest. The belief that interest is the robbery of industry is, I am persuaded, in large part due to a failure to discriminate between what is really capital and what is not. It really does seem that that whole defining what is capital, land, and labor, um, he who defines wins, I've heard it said. It's a big deal. So, a failure to discriminate between capital and what isn't capital, and between profits, which are properly interest, and profits which arise from other sources than the use of capital. If you recall that George didn't like the term profits because it conflates these sorts of things, and he avoids using it, whereas other economists use it, and he says that leads to confusion. In the speech and literature of the day, everyone is styled a capitalist who possesses what, independent of his labor, will yield him a return, while whatever is thus received is spoken of as the earnings or takings of capital. And we everywhere hear of the conflict of labor and capital. Yes, he was living under, people were capitalists, even though they were landowners and also capital lenders. Whether there is in reality any conflict between labor and capital, I do not yet ask the reader to make up his mind, but it will be well here to clear away some misapprehensions which confuse the judgment. Alright, you may be confused, and you may not realize it, and George may help you. Attention has already been called to the fact that land values, which constitute such an enormous part of what is commonly called capital, are not capital at all. Say it loud, say it clear. Land is not part of capital at all. And that rent, which is as commonly included in the receipts of capital, this would be land rent, I think, and which takes an ever increasing portion of the produce of an advancing community, is not the earnings of capital, and must be carefully separated from interest. It is not necessary now to dwell further upon this point. Attention has likewise been called to the fact that the stocks, bonds, etc., which constitute another part of what is commonly called capital, are not capital at all, but in some of their shapes these evidences of indebtedness so closely resemble capital, and in some cases actually perform or seem to perform the functions of capital, while they yield a return to their owners which is not only spoken of as interest but has every semblance of interest, that it is worth while, before attempting to clear the idea of interest from some form or other ambiguities that beset it, to speak again of these at greater length. All right, we're gonna dig in to stocks, bonds, etc. Yes, they themselves are not capital. And spoiler alert, he's just going to say that anything like IOUs or scrip, whatever that, or whatever, currency, they point to capital, but they are not actually things that can be used to assist in labor, and they're not actually things that can take advantage of the reproductive forces of nature. So anyway, here he goes. Nothing can be capital. Let it always be remembered that nothing can be capital. Let it always be remembered that is not wealth. Well, people are still gonna point at stocks, bonds, and dollars as wealth. That is to say, nothing can be capital that does not consist of actual, tangible things, not the spontaneous offerings of nature, which have in themselves, not by proxy, the power of directly or indirectly ministering to human desire. Tangible things with the power to directly or indirectly minister to human desire. Thus, a government bond is not capital, nor yet is it the representative of capital. Wait a minute, I thought it was the representative of capital. That capital that was once received for it by the government has been consumed unproductively, blown away from the mouths of cannon, used up in warships, expended in keeping men marching and drilling, killing and destroying. The bond cannot represent capital that has been destroyed. It does not represent capital at all. Okay, that's fair. It's yeah, when talking about a bond. It is simply a solemn declaration that the government will, some time or other, take by taxation from the then existing stock of the people so much wealth, which it will turn over to the holder of the bond, and that in the meanwhile it will from time to time take in the same way enough to make up to the holder the increase which so much capital as it some day promises to give him would yield him were it actually in his possession. Yes. Um, it is a promise to give back more wealth through the ways that the government gets wealth, taxation, force, which is, force and taxation are not necessarily wrong, I don't think. The immense sums which are thus taken from the produce of every modern country to pay interest on public debts are not the earnings or increase of capital, are not really interest in the strict sense of the term, but are taxes levied on the produce of labor and capital, leaving so much less for wages and so much less for real interest. Yeah, I mean, supposing the government used the capital from the bonds that was given to them instead of cannonballs, uh, did take advantage of the reproductive forces of nature and did uh, create more wealth, then it seems, we're back to the situation of just like a lender of capital and then interest being received. Um, but the fact that the government doesn't really produce wealth, generally, it makes that problematic. But sometimes, sometimes they make metro stations and parks, which are wealth creating. Oh, okay, here he's about to just talk about this. But supposing the bonds have been issued for the deepening of a river bed, the construction of lighthouses, or the erection of a public market, or supposing to embody the same idea while changing the illustration, they have been issued by a railroad company. Here they do represent capital existing and applied to productive uses, and like stock in a dividend-paying company may be considered as evidences of the ownership of capital. All right, George, you led me down a little trap. But they can be so considered only insofar as they actually represent capital, and not as they have been issued in excess of the capital used. Yes. Nearly all our railroad companies and other incorporations are loaded down in this way. Where $1 worth of capital has been really used, certificates for 2, 3, 4, 5, or even 10 have been issued, and upon this fictitious amount, interest or dividends are paid with more or less regularity. Yes, now we're coming to like the banking sector where they lend out more than they have, assuming that the government will print more, or we'll see. Now, what in excess of the amount due as interest to the real capital invested is thus earned by these companies and thus paid out, as well as the large sums absorbed by managing rings and never accounted for, is evidently not taken from the aggregate produce of the community on account of the services rendered by capital. It is not interest. If we are restricted to the terminology of economic writers who decompose profits into interest, insurance, and wages of superintendence, it must fall into the category of wages of superintendence. But while wages of superintendence clearly enough include the income derived from such personal qualities as skill, tact, enterprise, organizing ability, inventive power, character, etc., to the profits we are speaking of there is another contributing element which can only arbitrarily be classed with these, the element of monopoly. Uh, When James I granted to his minion the exclusive privilege of making gold and silver thread, and prohibited, under severe penalties, everyone else from making such thread, the income which Buckingham enjoyed in consequence did not arise from the interest upon the capital invested in the manufacture, nor from the skill of those who really conducted the operations, but from what he got from the king, viz., the exclusive privilege, in reality the power to levy a tax for his own purposes, upon all the users of such thread. That's what the minion got. From a similar source comes a large part of the profits which are commonly confounded with the earnings of capital. Receipts from the patents granted for a limited term of years for the purpose of encouraging invention are clearly attributable to this source, as are the returns derived from monopolies created by protective tariffs under the pretense of encouraging home industry. But there is another far more insidious and far more general form of monopoly. In the aggregation of large masses of capital under a common control, there is developed a new and essentially different power from that power of increase, which is a general characteristic of capital and which gives rise to interest. While the latter is, so to speak, constructive in its nature, the power which, as aggregation proceeds, rises upon it is destructive. It is the power of the same kind as that which James granted to Buckingham, and it is often exercised with as reckless a disregard not only of the industrial but of the personal rights of individuals. A railroad company approaches a small town as a highwayman approaches his victim. The threat, "If you do not accede to our terms, we will leave your town 2 or 3 miles to one side," is as efficacious as the "stand and deliver" when backed by a cocked pistol. Is that what robbers would say? Stand, not stick 'em up, stand and deliver? I always thought responding to that was like doing something brave. But if it's like you're forced to do it, I mean, I guess it is brave to stand up to somebody who's got a gun. I don't know. I don't know this term's origins. Anyway, we'll continue with George. For the threat of the railroad company is not merely to deprive the town of the benefits which the railroad might give, it is to put it in a far worse position than if no railroad had been built. Or if, where there is water communication, an opposition boat is put on, rates are reduced until she is forced off, and then the public are compelled to pay the cost of the operation, just as the Rohillas were obliged to pay the 40 lakhs with which Suraja Dowlah hired of Warren Hastings an English force to assist him in desolating their country and decimating their people. Thought we were Spanish, but then this makes me think it was Indian. So this might have been Rohillas. The Rohillas. I don't know. And just as robbers unite to plunder in concert and divide the spoil, so do the trunk lines of railroads unite to raise rates and pool their earnings, or these Pacific roads form a combination with the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, by which toll gates are virtually established on land and ocean. It's just like monopoly railroads. Reading Railroad, Pennsylvania, B&O, and the short line. And just as Buckingham's creatures, under authority of the gold thread patent, searched private houses and seized papers and persons for purposes of lust and extortion, so does the great telegraph company, which, by the power of associated capital, deprives the people of the United States of the full benefits of a beneficent invention, tamper with correspondence, and crush out newspapers which offend it. Yeah, George was a newspaper man. Yeah, yeah. Monopoly. Alright, I'm gonna end there for today. Think on these things.